When you were a child, you were told that mirrors are harmless. Just glass, just reflection, nothing more. But for centuries, some of the most educated, rational, technologically advanced people on Earth behaved as if that was a lie they could not afford to believe. Every night, at the exact moment daylight began to fade, entire households went silent. Servants moved carefully. Heavy fabrics were lifted with both hands. Velvet, brocade, thick silk. One by one, mirrors disappeared behind darkness, sealed away as if they were windows during a storm. Not because of vanity, not because of superstition, but because something about mirrors after sunset was considered unsafe. And this wasn't folklore whispered in remote villages. This ritual was practiced in London townhouses, Paris salons, Vienna apartments, and Russian estates. Engineers, doctors, professors, industrialists, people who built railroads and telegraph lines, people who trusted measurement, logic, and progress, and yet, every night, they covered their mirrors as if they were hiding something alive. The question is simple and deeply uncomfortable. Why would an entire civilization that believed it was entering the age of reason still behave as if reflection itself could betray them? Modern explanations try to make this fear sound childish. They say people were afraid of spirits or ghosts or the souls of the dead, that mirrors were linked to mourning rituals, that people feared seeing the deceased. But the documents left behind tell a very different story. They don't describe fear of the dead, they describe fear of observation. Not fear of what appeared in the mirror, fear of what looked back. To understand why, you have to step into the world of the 19th century, a world balanced on a knife's edge between old knowledge and new science. Gas lamps illuminated city streets, but homes still lived in shadow. Electricity existed, but it was barely understood. Physics was confident, but incomplete, and mirrors were everywhere. They were enormous, floor to ceiling, framed in gold and carved wood, some reaching 3 meters in height. They weren't decorative accents, they dominated rooms. They reflected fireplaces, chandeliers, entire walls, and they were impossibly expensive. One mirror could cost as much as a year's income for a wealthy family. These were not mass-produced objects, they were technological marvels. And yet, every etiquette manual of the era contained the same instruction. At dusk, all mirrors must be fully covered. Not partially, not symbolically, completely. No gaps, no slits, as carefully as one would seal a door. This rule appears again and again across countries, languages, and cultures. The wording changes, but the instruction does not. Cover mirrors before nightfall. Never leave 2 mirrors facing each other. Never place a mirror opposite a doorway. These weren't suggestions, they were treated as safety measures. And here's where the story becomes impossible to dismiss, because alongside these rules, something else appears in the historical record. Medical reports, private diaries, hospital archives. Case after case describing the same phenomenon. Doctors at the time called it mirror madness, mirror melancholy, reflection-induced hysteria. People who were otherwise healthy began reporting the same symptoms. At night, mirrors stopped behaving correctly. They delayed reflections. They showed unfamiliar rooms, unknown faces, places that didn't exist. Some patients became convinced they were being watched. Others claimed they were seeing another time entirely. And the most troubling part wasn't fear, it was accuracy. Patients described architectural details of buildings that had been demolished decades earlier. They spoke dialects linguists believed were extinct. They referenced events that had never been officially recorded. This wasn't random hallucination. It was structured, consistent, repeating across continents. Let's look at one documented case. In 1867, the McGregor family moved into a newly renovated Georgian building on Princes Street in Edinburgh. Wealthy merchants, educated, respected. Their new home featured enormous mirrors installed by the previous owner, covering nearly an entire wall in the main living room. Within 2 weeks, the family's youngest daughter refused to sleep alone. She claimed the mirror in her bedroom showed a different house at night, different furniture, different walls. Her parents dismissed it as imagination. Until the adults began noticing it too. James McGregor, the father, recorded in his diary that he woke repeatedly with the sensation of being watched. One night, by moonlight, he saw that the mirror opposite his bed reflected a room that was not his own. When he lit a candle, the image vanished. A maid later fled screaming from the corridor, claiming she saw a woman in old-fashioned clothing inside the mirror. The figure raised her hand, slowly, as if testing the surface between them. The maid never returned to that part of the house. A priest was called. Blessings were performed. Nothing changed. The mirrors continued to misbehave. Skeptics today say this was mass hysteria, stress, suggestion, but that explanation collapses under one simple question. Why did the same symptoms appear in different countries among people who had never met, describing the same experiences in strikingly similar language? And why did educated scientists of the era take these reports seriously enough to investigate them? A professor of natural philosophy was invited to the McGregor home, a man trained in measurement, not mysticism. He brought thermometers accurate to fractions of a degree, magnetometers, photographic plates, equipment considered cutting edge for the time. For 7 nights, he recorded data. Officially, he reported nothing unusual. Privately, his diary told a very different story. According to his notes, between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, the mirror behaved as if it were not a passive surface. Reflections were delayed by fractions of a second, as though light was traveling a much greater distance than the space between observer and glass. The temperature around the mirror dropped without drafts or explanation. Magnetic instruments fluctuated unpredictably, and photographic plates revealed a faint glow emitted by the mirror in total darkness. His conclusion was simple and terrifying. The mirror was not reflecting light. It was interacting with something unknown. He never published the results, and he advised the family to cover every mirror permanently. Why would a scientist trained in the strict logic of physics choose silence? Because acknowledging those results would have meant dismantling the foundations of everything he believed about reality. Now ask yourself something unsettling. If mirrors were truly just glass and metal, why did mirror production require such secrecy, violence, and state-level enforcement? The most famous mirrors in history came from very specific places: Venice, Bohemia, Russia. Not everywhere, only there. And the craftsmen who made them lived like prisoners. Venetian mirror makers were forbidden to leave the island where they worked. Disclosure of techniques was punishable by death. Families passed knowledge orally, never in writing. If a bloodline ended, the knowledge died with it. Over the course of a century, more than 20 documented cases describe runaway mirror masters being hunted down and eliminated. Not fined, not imprisoned, killed. This level of brutality was not applied to other lucrative crafts: silk, weapons, ceramics, all profitable, none guarded with this level of paranoia. Why mirrors? What exactly were these men protecting? At the same time, something else was happening. Europe was absorbing massive amounts of knowledge from the East. After the fall of Constantinople, manuscripts, diagrams, and artifacts flooded into Venice. Entire libraries changed hands. Technologies with no clear origin appeared suddenly, fully formed. The theory that emerges from these fragments is disturbing. Mirror makers were not inventors, they were custodians. They inherited a technology they did not fully understand, a technology that predated them. Their role was not to innovate, but to preserve and reproduce something already ancient. And sometimes, that technology malfunctioned. Which brings us to an antique dealer in London in the year 1881. He purchased a Venetian mirror from a bankrupt aristocratic estate, 15th century, extraordinary clarity, a frame covered in astronomical symbols, geometric patterns, and unfamiliar diagrams. Decorative, according to experts, meaningless ornamentation, until the mirror was installed. At night, it showed a different room, different furniture, different books. Always the same time window, always under moonlight. Then one night, the dealer saw a man, not behind him, inside the mirror. A man dressed in clothing from the 15th century, writing at a desk that did not exist anymore. When their eyes met, the figure did not vanish. It approached the glass. And for the first time, someone realized the most frightening possibility of all. The mirror was not showing the past. It was allowing contact with it. And if that was true, then the rituals, the secrecy, the executions, the destruction of old mirrors during wars and revolutions, all of it begins to make a terrifying kind of sense. Because if mirrors were tools, not objects, then an entire civilization once had access to a network we no longer understand. And what happens when technology outlives the knowledge required to control it? That is where this story truly begins. If mirrors were only superstition, the story would end with frightened families and misunderstood scientists. But it doesn't. Because what follows is not fear, it is action, coordinated, deliberate, and unusually quiet. By the late 19th century, something had shifted. Reports of mirror-related disturbances were no longer dismissed outright. They were being collected, studied, and then buried. Across Europe and America, small groups of researchers began noticing the same pattern. Old mirrors behaved differently than new ones, not symbolically, physically. They reacted to darkness, moonlight, proximity, and alignment in ways that violated the accepted laws of optics. These were not paranormal investigators. They were physicists, engineers, medical doctors, people whose careers depended on being taken seriously. And many of them reached the same conclusion before stopping their work entirely. The mirror was not passive. It was doing something. One of the strangest consistencies appeared in timing. Almost every recorded anomaly occurred within the same nightly window, roughly between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, always in low light, almost always involving moonlight, not candlelight or gas lamps. Why would that matter? At the time, the moon was already suspected to influence tides, biological rhythms, and atmospheric electricity. The idea that lunar cycles affected the Earth's magnetic field was controversial, but not absurd. What no one was prepared for was the idea that mirrors might respond to those changes. Several private experiments attempted to isolate variables. Mirrors were observed in sealed rooms, in basements, in upper floors, with different orientations. North-facing mirrors behaved differently than south-facing ones. Mirrors near large metal structures produced stronger effects. Mirrors positioned opposite each other caused disturbances to intensify dramatically. And this is where the placement rules begin to look less like superstition and more like engineering. Two mirrors facing each other create an infinite corridor of reflections. Anyone who has stood between them knows the effect, a tunnel of repeated images vanishing into darkness. 19th century etiquette manuals warned against this configuration more strongly than any other, not as a bad omen, as a danger. Some texts even used language that resembles modern physics. Words like amplification, resonance, and channel appear in translations, poorly understood at the time, but unmistakable in intent. If a single mirror could receive something, then two mirrors could strengthen it. That realization terrified people, because it meant mirrors were not just showing something strange. They were interacting with it. In France, Austria, and England, psychiatric hospitals recorded patients who experienced sudden cognitive changes after prolonged exposure to mirrors at night. These patients did not behave like typical psychosis cases. Their speech patterns changed, but coherently. Their handwriting shifted style. Their knowledge expanded in specific directions. One patient described street layouts of a medieval district that had been destroyed centuries earlier. When historians later compared his descriptions to excavation maps, the alignment was accurate down to alley width. Another patient began sketching mechanical devices he insisted he had seen inside the glass. Years later, fragments of similar designs were found in uncatalogued archives. Doctors didn't know what to do with this information, so they changed the diagnosis. Mirror madness disappeared from medical literature not because the phenomenon stopped, but because it was renamed, diluted, and absorbed into broader categories that required no further explanation. At the same time, something else was happening quietly and efficiently. The mirrors themselves were changing. For centuries, mirrors were made using amalgamation, a dangerous process involving mercury, silver, and tin. The reflective layer was thick, complex, and chemically unstable. It preserved imperfections, variations, microstructures that modern silvering methods intentionally eliminate. By the late 19th century, chemical silvering replaced amalgamation, faster, cheaper, safer, and crucially, simpler. The new mirrors reflected more cleanly, more uniformly, and nothing else. Reports of delayed reflections vanished. Temperature anomalies stopped appearing. Magnetic disturbances ceased. Cases of mirror-induced psychological effects dropped sharply. Officially, this was progress. Unofficially, it was containment. And then came destruction. During wars, revolutions, and political upheaval in the early 20th century, old mirrors were smashed en masse. They were labeled symbols of aristocracy, bourgeois decadence, relics of an oppressive past. But the pattern is too precise to ignore. Only antique mirrors were targeted, not modern ones, not newly produced glass, only old mirrors, especially those traced to Venetian, Flemish, or Russian origins. Entire collections vanished. Museum inventories list mirrors destroyed without photographs or detailed records. Private estates reported missing items long before bombs fell or mobs arrived. It wasn't random, it was selective, which raises a chilling question. Who knew which mirrors mattered? To answer that, we have to return to Venice. For centuries, Venice was not just a trading hub, it was an information filter. Knowledge from the East passed through it before reaching Europe. Manuscripts, diagrams, instruments, ideas that arrived fully formed with no developmental history. Venetian institutions didn't just protect mirror recipes, they protected something else: context. Mirror masters were not allowed to record their methods, not because of secrecy alone, but because writing fixes knowledge. It allows replication without understanding. Oral transmission forces interpretation, adaptation, and caution. The knowledge had to stay unstable, because stable knowledge spreads, and whatever mirrors truly were, someone did not want that. This becomes clearer when examining the frames of surviving mirrors. The astronomical symbols were not decorative, they corresponded to specific planetary alignments, dates, cycles. The placement of symbols matched celestial charts with unsettling precision. This implies that mirror production was not just chemical, it was temporal. Certain conditions mattered, certain moments, certain alignments, which aligns disturbingly well with the timing of anomalies. Mirrors misbehaved when environmental conditions shifted, when atmospheric electricity fluctuated, when the Earth's magnetic field changed subtly during lunar cycles. In other words, mirrors responded to the planet itself. At this point, the story stops sounding mystical and starts sounding technological. Imagine a device designed to store information in light, not digitally, not magnetically, but optically, chemically, and structurally. A medium capable of retaining impressions not just of images, but of the conditions under which those images were formed. A memory embedded in material. If such a device existed, it would explain everything. The accuracy of visions, the emotional intensity, the sense of presence, the reason why contact felt interactive rather than recorded. The mirror was not replaying the past, it was accessing it. And this is where fear becomes policy, because a technology that allows access to other times is not just dangerous, it is destabilizing. It undermines authority, history, control. It reveals inconsistencies, lost civilizations, suppressed knowledge. And if fragments of that system were still active in the 19th century, even malfunctioning ones, then the safest solution was not study, it was removal. Silence, followed by simplification. Make mirrors safe, make them inert, make them forget. And most importantly, make people forget that mirrors were ever anything else. But memory is stubborn, and traces remain. In private letters, in destroyed diaries, in architecture, in placement rules that no longer make sense, in an inherited discomfort when standing alone in front of a dark mirror late at night. That feeling is not superstition. It is recognition. Because something about mirrors once mattered enough to kill for, to hide, and to erase. And in the final part of this story, we confront the most unsettling possibility of all, that mirrors were not isolated artifacts. They were part of a network, and that network once spanned the entire world. By the time the 20th century arrived, the world believed it had outgrown its fears. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Physics declared itself nearly complete. Industry standardized everything it touched, and mirrors, once rare and dangerous, became cheap, safe, and everywhere. Bathrooms, elevators, storefronts, screens. Nothing strange happens anymore. And that, perhaps, was the point. Because when you examined what disappeared along with the old mirrors, you realize it wasn't just superstition that faded. It was an entire way of interacting with reality. To understand what was lost, you have to stop thinking of mirrors as objects and start thinking of them as infrastructure. Old mirrors were never meant to stand alone. Their placement rules were not aesthetic, they were functional. Mirrors were positioned in relation to doors, windows, fireplaces, and walls in ways that formed patterns repeated across continents. These patterns aligned disturbingly well with older architectural systems that modern historians still struggle to explain. Cathedrals with copper domes, star-shaped fortresses, cities laid out along geometric grids that ignored terrain but obey mathematical ratios. Individually, these structures seem symbolic. Together, they look engineered. For centuries, scholars have wondered why cathedrals were built far larger than necessary for worship, why their spires were tipped with conductive metals, why acoustics, light paths, and resonance were treated with obsessive precision. What if they were not just places of belief? What if they were nodes? Imagine a world-spanning system that did not transmit electricity through wires, but information through light, resonance, and atmospheric interaction. A system that used the Earth itself as part of the circuit. In that system, mirrors would not be decoration. They would be interfaces. Old mirrors were thick, layered, chemically complex. Their amalgams were not optimized for clarity alone, but for interaction. The precise ratios of metals mattered. The conditions under which they were applied mattered. Even the astronomical timing mattered. Because the medium was not just reflecting light, it was storing it. Modern science accepts that materials can retain information, magnetic tape, photographic film, crystals, even biological tissue. The idea that light impressions could be preserved chemically was already understood in the 19th century. What was not understood was the implication. If light carries information and a surface can store light, then a mirror could theoretically preserve moments, not as frozen images, but as interactive impressions encoded into material structure. And under certain environmental conditions, those impressions could resurface. This explains why old mirrors behaved differently at night, why moonlight mattered, why proximity, orientation, and pairing amplified effects, why the experiences felt responsive, not pre-recorded. The mirror was not replaying the past like a photograph. It was synchronizing with it. And synchronization is dangerous because synchronization collapses distance. It allows overlap. Which brings us back to the global pattern. Maps of historical mirror manufactories align suspiciously with maps of older energy sites, locations where ancient temples, fortresses, or unexplained earthworks once stood. Places where the local magnetic field behaves oddly even today. Venice, Bohemia, certain regions of Russia. Not places with the best sand, places with the right conditions. When revolutions and wars erupted in the early 20th century, these locations were hit hardest, not just politically, culturally. Archives burned, buildings demolished, entire city layers buried or rebuilt. And again, the destruction was selective. Old mirrors vanished, old technologies disappeared, old knowledge fragmented. The official story says this was progress, but progress usually preserves information. This erased it. Consider how quickly mirror-related diagnoses vanished from medicine once old mirrors were gone. Not gradually, abruptly, as if removing the source removed the symptom. Consider how etiquette rules faded without explanation. No scientific refutation, no public discussion, just silence. Consider how the idea of mirrors as dangerous became absurd within a single generation. That kind of cultural amnesia does not happen by accident. It happens when something is intentionally normalized out of existence. And now we arrive at the most uncomfortable truth of all. Modern mirrors are safe because they are incomplete. They reflect only what is directly in front of them. They do not store, they do not interact, they do not remember. They are dead. Which means we didn't just lose the danger. We lost the tool. Old mirrors were not mystical portals in the way horror stories imagine. They were technological artifacts operating on principles we no longer understand. Principles tied to a different physics. A physics that treated the earth, the atmosphere, and light itself as active components. A civilization before ours may have used that system to transmit knowledge across distances and time. Not messages, context, memory, experience. When that civilization collapsed, the equipment remained, misunderstood, feared, used cautiously, then gradually dismantled. By the 19th century, people were living among artifacts they could not repair and barely control. They knew enough to be afraid, enough to cover mirrors at night, enough to avoid certain configurations, enough to sense danger without being able to explain it. When the system began malfunctioning, when mirrors started bleeding old information into the present, it became intolerable. Not because it was scary, because it was revealing. Revealing inconsistencies in history, revealing lost knowledge, revealing that progress was not linear, and that modernity was not the first peak. So the mirrors were simplified, then replaced, then destroyed, and finally, forgotten. Today, we are surrounded by reflective surfaces, screens that mirror our faces back to us while feeding us curated realities. We stare into them constantly, without fear, without awareness. But sometimes, late at night, when a screen goes dark or a reflection appears where you didn't expect it, something stirs. A moment of unease, a sense that you are not alone in the image. That feeling is not imagination, It is inheritance, a residue of memory passed down from people who knew that some technologies demand respect, not understanding, that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed easily, that some knowledge costs more than curiosity is willing to pay. The 19th century was the last time humanity stood close enough to that edge to feel its pull. They chose caution. We chose forgetting. And now we live in a world full of mirrors that show us only ourselves, while the deeper reflections remain buried, shattered, or sealed behind layers of modern simplicity. The question is no longer whether mirrors were once dangerous. The question is whether we would even recognize it if they became so again. Because the most effective way to neutralize a threat is not to fight it. It is to convince everyone it never mattered. Subscribe to the channel. There are still traces left, still patterns to uncover, still questions official history refuses to ask. And sometimes the truth isn't hidden in darkness. It's hidden in plain sight. Reflected back at you.